Today, Tuesday, June 22nd, is the feast of two martyrs, Saints John Fisher and Thomas More, one a chancellor of Cambridge University and cardinal, and the other chancellor of England and lawyer, both of whom gave their lives in 1535 within a few weeks of one another because of opposition to the active supremacy of the Church in favor of King Henry VIII. Fisher, born in 1469, who became Bishop of Rochester, was so famous for his preaching, he was chosen to preach at the funeral of King Henry VII. A vigorous defender of the Catholic faith at the time of the Reformation, he wrote 4 volumes of refutation of the teachings of Martin Luther. He became chaplain to the King's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and preached also at her funeral. Always a scholar, he upheld against Protestants in various English universities the doctrines of the real presence of the Eucharist, as well as the sacrificial nature of the Mass. At the same time, he was committed to church reform, but from within rather than without. At his synod, he had spoken out strongly against the worldliness and laxity of the higher clergy. An idiosyncrasy was his habit of keeping a skull on his desk and at meals to remind him of death. Later, he protested Henry VIII's new title as, quote, Supreme Head of the Church of England, unquote, suggesting it be qualified with the words, quote, so far as the law of Christ allows, unquote. When Henry deposed Fisher and imprisoned him in the Tower of London for several months, Pope Paul III named him a cardinal. Henry retorted that even if Fisher were sent a red hat, he would have no head on which to wear it. After 10 months in the Tower, he was beheaded. The king's contempt for John Fisher continued even after his death. His naked body was left on the scaffold all day. His head was hung on London Bridge for 2 weeks and then thrown into the Thames. Thomas More, born in 1478, described as one of the most highly respected men of his time, known for his wit and learning, author of the popular Latin classic Utopia, probably was the most famous victim of the king's persecution of Catholics. Earlier in his life, he had considered a monastic vocation. He was a man of deep and demanding faith. He married and maintained a substantial household. After the death of his wife, he soon remarried, and with a good stepmother took delight with his children, especially his loyal daughter, Margaret, and he was very concerned about their education. Known for his wit and keen mind, although from a commoner rather than a noble background, he had risen in public office to be a close friend of Henry VIII. The king admired him and chose him as Lord Chancellor, in which his capability aided in the Pope naming Henry, quote, defender of the faith, unquote. However, Thomas resigned his position when he refused to support the king's intentions regarding the authority of the Church, sparked by the king's decision to abandon his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. Until then, with some hesitation, he accepted the king's new title, Protector and Supreme Head of the Church of England, but with John Fisher's qualification, so far as the law of Christ allows. Like Fisher, More was also imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he remained for 15 months. He refused to support Parliament when it passed the Acts of Supremacy, which proclaimed the king only supreme head of the Church of England. He denied that Parliament had the authority to set up a temporal lord as head of the church. Condemned to death in a trial on perjured evidence, he expressed the hope that he and his judges would hereafter in heaven all meet merrily together. His final words were that he was dying for the faith and was the king's good servant, but God's first. The deaths of Fisher and Moore shocked many. Together they were canonized in 1935. Moore, in recent years, became popular as a result of the movie A Man for All Seasons. On the other hand, Hilary Mantel's book and film, Wolf Hall, sought to characterize him as having been a persecutor of Protestants in his own right, in his role of preventing heresy. This view has since been clearly challenged. The patron of Catholic lawyers, Pope John Paul II named him in the year 2000 patron saint of politicians and public officials. Here in Washington, we have a church named in Thomas More's honor and a Thomas More Society for Catholic jurists. The cathedral of our neighboring diocese of Arlington has him as its patron. As for Fisher, Pope Francis chose our own auxiliary bishop of Washington, Michael Fisher, to be Bishop of Buffalo, as a fisher of men. In a time when responsible public leadership is very much needed, we recognize both John Fisher and Thomas More as fine models and intercessors as we pray for our own church and nation.